quick introduction of this incredible human being. Xiye Bastida is a climate justice activist with an Otomi-Toltec background, a public speaker who advocates for youth and Indigenous rights. She is pursuing a degree in environment studies and Latinx studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a very renowned activist, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce her and hear some of her insights today. So let me just...
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, first of all, sorry I couldn't join you in person. I'm in the middle of finals, so I had to stay in university. But I am so honored to be here and excited to share some of my thoughts on what justice means to me, but also what it means in terms of movement building and specifically the youth climate movement. So one time I went to the Center for Justice at Columbia University to give a talk there. And we started by asking people, what does justice mean to you? And one of the students said, justice looks like something that I've never seen and I've never felt. And when he said that, something shook inside me because I realized that that was the same for me. We are pursuing something that we don't know. We don't know what it feels like. We don't know how it looks like. We can just do our best to imagine it. And I think for so long we have been in this position when we are pursuing something that is just the right thing to pursue, but we are restricting ourselves in making that concrete because we need to let our imaginations take us there. And I think that's where the youth movement comes through, because we are often called idealistic, but in reality, I think that if we're not imagining a better world, we're never going to get there. For me, justice means a constant fight for the pursuit of fairness and morality. I think that everything that we do has to be founded on principles of reciprocity, principles of intergenerational cooperation, principles of just believing in each other, but most importantly, making people feel empowered. I had no idea how much apathy influenced people's decisions. Apathy means knowing that something is wrong, but not doing anything about it because you don't believe that your voice will make a change. The other day, I was talking with my friend from college, and we were having this discussion on individual actions and climate, and if individual actions actually made a difference. And she said, well, I've heard you talk about climate, and I agree with you, but I don't think my voice can do anything about it. In that moment, I felt really sad that my friend didn't think that her voice mattered, and she didn't think that her actions had an impact. And I told her, my parents raised me to believe that I can change the world, but I didn't know that people were not taught that when they were growing up. And I think that that is why it's so instrumental that when we are in movements, when we talk to each other, we say these things. We are going to change the world because we don't have another option. When we talk about climate specifically, we talk about the fact that 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees make a huge difference in terms of how on how the future is going to look like. And so that is why we cannot stop fighting, even if we are still seeing the fossil fuel industry drilling, even if we're still seeing all these climate neutrality plans by 2050. My school that is doing research on climate science, on climate, on everything climate related, is set to be net zero by 2042. By 2042, I'm going to be 40 years old. So the university where I'm in, where I'm studying environmental studies and where they're teaching me all of the science of the climate crisis, won't be carbon neutral, which is not even carbon negative, by 2042. So all of these things are things that are concrete in my view, but also present avenues for us to do something about it. And here's where I'm going to talk about the organization that I started because of the pandemic. It's called Re-Earth Initiative, and the name came from a play in words with reusing, recycling, because we know that we have that was our extent of our knowledge in terms of climate solutions. And when I found out that only 9% of plastic gets recycled, I told myself, why are we still teaching people about recycling when in reality we should be teaching people about how to lobby your politicians to ban plastic? And so the plain words is, we have to recreate, reimagine, regenerate, re-earth. And our founding principles as a team is basically we operate in a structure that is horizontal and a little not decentralized, but I think the movement as a whole does operate in a decentralized manner. We are a smaller organization, so we can't be decentralized. But the horizontal leadership basically means that there is not one person making decisions for everyone. There is, listening and talking and making decisions that are best for the whole community. We also have, aside from the operations team, which is the team that runs, the website, runs the campaigns, we have a community, which means that everybody who wants to be part of the organization, but not in an operations way, can be part of just community building and having people to talk to and having activities. And we organize movie watching and we organize different things. We also have community time, which, as teenagers, that literally just means talking to each other and having fun. Because if we are in this work that can be so hard and can lead you to, so many sleepless nights along with school, we have to be able to have that community time as a form of community care. This job is for the long run, and we can't afford everybody to just burn out. And I think that another thing that we do a lot is, and we talk about a lot, is just knowing history. There's this quote that I've heard a lot, which you've probably heard as well, which says, "Those who don't learn from history are bound to repeat it." And I cannot tell you how many times I have seen this happen to me. I have seen this happen to the movement, especially with a movement that youth are leading. It seems like we are the first ones that are doing all of this. And then I started taking classes on the history of the environmental justice movement, and I found things like the first People of Color Summit happened in 1991, and they came up with 17 principles of environmental justice. So all of the language that we've been trying to find as a climate justice movement had already been written down and agreed upon in 1991, which is more than 30 years ago. And the language is language that we would use today. They crafted it in a very comprehensive way. And, another example is the other day I was doing a case study on this group from New York City called Uprose, which is a community group in Sunset Park that, fights for climate justice, and they want their area to not be occupied by new development, new high rises that are going to drive people out of the community. And they also have things like solar, community solar, which basically means that they're creating their own solar grid in Brooklyn. And I was watching some of their YouTube videos from 2014. And this 17-year-old activist was talking about, we are the last generation who can do something about the climate crisis. We are the last generation who can call out environmental racism and who can call out how unjust the climate crisis can be and how our community deserves that justice, deserves that dignity. That was in 2014 when she was 17. Now we're in 2022. I don't want to do the math and do it wrong, but she's more than 20 years old. I don't know. I should have done the math before. But the point is that I started my activism in an organizing level when I was 17. And I don't want it to be, 8 years into the future and still be saying the same things over and over again, which is why it's so important to learn from history and learn from each other and listen to each other. Not only listen to each other from the past, but also through across sectors. And that's why we talk so much about intersectionality. And that's why we talk so much about the fact that everything is interconnected. Because if not, we're just going to be operating in silos and be learning all of these things for the first time so many times, when we should be building from the knowledge that other people have, from the wisdom that other people have, and always have that power to be able to imagine what the world that we want to build looks like, with timelines, with scientific backing, with all of the things that we have today. But none of that is going to happen if we don't teach ourselves that it's important to be a good learner if we want to be good communicators. And I think that school has really taught me that, every time I take a new class, I am reminded of how important it is to be reading every single day. And you're going to learn about so many different topics, and all of them are just going to influence and feed into how you see the world, and be able to ultimately communicate better with people. So I think that the last thing I'm going to talk about before we go to Q&A is the nature of the climate justice movement. As most of you must have seen, in 2019, it just grew exponentially because, millions of youth from around the world walked out with their parents, with their schools, with the adults in their lives as well. And that momentum that was built in 2019 was stagnated by the pandemic. But I think that once we come out of the pandemic, we have to go into building that movement in the most powerful way that we can, because time is running out. We're going to be 2022, 2023. We are going to go into COP27. I remember when I was at COP26 and feeling like the world leaders weren't listening to us. And, Obama wrote a message to the world leaders saying that they have to listen to youth. When he was president, COP number 14 was going on. That had already been 14 years of governments getting together to address the climate crisis. And he, that was president for 8 years, didn't do enough. So, we also have to get out of that cycle of, yes, learning from history, but also stop, living in that past of we didn't do enough back then, and it's this person's fault or this person's fault. It is about looking at where we are today, knowing that there are specific people who are making the climate crisis be a thing still. And those people are the fossil fuel industry. And we have to be able to create organizations and be able to create systems to call those people out and to bring them to justice. And I think that is the essence of what justice means in the climate movement. It means be able to call out the people that are making everybody else suffer for their profit or for whatever in an intentional way. And so I think that is where our activism is going to be headed, coming out of the pandemic. Is going to be headed not only towards advocating for legislation in the political realm, and also a cultural shift in our everyday lives, but most importantly, be able to have these systems, these mechanisms, these legal pathways to call out ecocide, to call out the industries that are still polluting, that are still extracting in ways that are damaging our planet and our communities. So I think that's what I wanted to talk about today, the nuances of justice and where I think the climate movement stands.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, but more importantly, just vital. So I was wondering if I could start off the Q&A because I'm selfish and I wanted to ask a question. Earlier, we had this talk, which was absolutely incredible, by one of our participants, Arthur Dahl. And he was talking about how our systems need to change, like in an economic basis, but outside of economics, how we need to redefine our GDP or change kind of what we see as capital. And as you said, youth throughout history have been the point of change. And like you said about your friend not feeling like they were not an activist, but that their voice couldn't be heard. And my faith uses this term that I really like, that we're all protagonists of social change. And so I was wondering, with all these huge concepts that are global in nature, what can youth do first to create organizations like Re-Earth? What are some of your learnings from that? And secondly, since we're a very intergenerational group here, and there's not a ton of youth, but there are tons of protagonists for social change, intergenerationally, what can adults do to empower youth's voices and to help, take climate activism from just protest, which is very vital, but into organizations like Re-Earth?
Yeah, those are awesome questions. To answer your first one, I think that, the Re-Earth Initiative is a global organization. We have youth from all over the world, India, Singapore, Costa Rica, Mexico, Chile. And that is amazing because I know that wherever I am in the world, there's people who share my same principles and people who I can trust and people who I have built a movement with. But it also showed me the importance of having a movement where you live locally. And I think that that is the best advice I can give to youth who want to start an organization, is get involved with your local community. Know that we will always be connected to your global community. And I think there's many, many pathways where we can see that happen. But if you don't, I heard this really, really beautiful quote. I love quotes, if you didn't realize. There's this really beautiful quote that says, we are the roots that weather the storm. And that basically means if you have roots in your community, you are able to withstand anything. And that is true not only, symbolically, but it's also true just factually. Like places that have better, manglars are going to be able to withstand storms better. And so I think, that's in short, that's the advice. Be able to form your own community locally, and that is going to get you so much farther because you're going to be able to lobby your local government and be able to change your local institutions. To your second question, we do all of this work so that we can be in spaces like this, so that we can talk to adults, so that we can infiltrate businesses and governments. And once you hear what a young person feels, once you hear that we don't want to grow up and be scared of the future, we don't want to grow up and have our kids be scared of the future, like this is real for us. With the IPCC, we're looking at crop failure by 2030, which is what we saw. I don't know if you saw that viral video of this girl who's talking to the media and they're just telling her like she's exaggerating. And so my petition really from adults is, you don't have to change your life to be part of this movement. You just have to bring everything that you have into your existing position of influence to be able to shift it. That means institutions, that means your local government, that means the neighborhood that you live in. Has my institution divested from fossil fuels? What are we consuming? How much waste are we producing? Where are we getting our energy? All of these things that might be very localized can have tremendous systemic impact when all of us do it. And obviously never stopping to advocate for policy that actually creates systemic change.
Thank you so much. If we want to open up for questions.
I was going to suggest that we get people to come up and speak at the microphone.
That makes a lot of sense. Does anyone have a question who wants to come up?
Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you and to hear from you. I'm Veronica. I'd like to ask, what is it that you think that we need to do in terms of leadership to make the difference that we need? Because I see climate justice, or a lack of climate justice, as being as much a failure of leadership as it is anything else.
Well, I think leadership comes in many forms. Sometimes we say that our politicians are our leaders, and most often the youth are saying they're not actually leading us. But I think the most important thing is to remember that all of these politicians that are elected officials work for us. And that's something that we forget about a lot. In the US, we say that, well, I always say that because even though I can't vote, I like to remind politicians that they work for the people who elected them. And that means that they have to represent, what we're striving for in New York City. That is, for example, the Climate and Leadership Community Protection Act, the Climate and Community Investment Act, which is legislation that is going to change the state entirely in terms of where it gets their energy, how buildings are built, how buildings are retrofitted. But in a more general sense of leadership, I think that, there has to be a lot of consciousness around the fact that one person can't be the leader. It has to be a community-led effort movement. And we have this tendency as humans to single out a person or single out an organization and see that person or that organization as just somebody to follow. But if we want the climate movement to work, it has to be, rooted in community. And it has to be rooted in like really talking to each other and seeing what community you're trying to build. But most importantly, with the intergenerational aspect, my promise is that when I grow up, I'm going to listen to youth. And I think that most adults who are youth never think of when we are going to be adults and what are we going to do then. The advice is to always always hold the hand of somebody older and always hold the hand of somebody younger in your daily lives. Who am I getting, wisdom from, and who am I giving wisdom to? And when we think of leadership in that way, not in like a pyramid way, but in a horizontal, interconnected way, things actually start mattering to you in a different way. And it's not just about how much money your organization is funding, but it is about the impact that you're having, and it's about the morality that you're grounded in. So I hope that made sense.
Hi, Xiye. Just to say, first of all, it's forbidden to say that 1991 was 30 years ago. It was only 10 years ago to some of us, But no, it's more seriously, I think the idea of not blaming the generation before and treating it like a relay race when the baton comes to you, that you run with it, rather than go, oh well, you were too slow, like why didn't you come faster? But and also we have had this sort of, I think, collective shift from protests, as you say, back in 2018, 2019, against what we don't want. And now it's starting to move towards like, what specifically are we doing to move towards what we do want, which is where we can get results, having smart goals, like what do we want instead of this? And equally where you have, traditionally the boycott, divest and sanction approach, there is that punitive approach, but also then there's this more sort of, more positively stated approach, which is like, what are we investing in instead of that? What's the alternative? So having, like I say, positively stated outcomes that we can build on, instead of, because your energy dissipates when you talk about, when you're angry against what you don't want, ultimately it leads to what you're trying to build. And I think that what you're doing with Re-Earth is trying to focus on what you're trying to build instead. And could you talk a bit about what specifically Re-Earth is trying to create, and the principles that the vision that you have specifically that you want to bring about?
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. And I remember one time when we were on a strike and somebody said, are we marching against something or for something? Because if we're marching against something, I don't want to join. if we're marching for it, I will. And, you know, that really made me think about the fact that we are so, when we state our demands, it's always framed in a negative way. And that is because we have had negative impacts out of the actions of, you know, of the fossil fuel industry, of policy that hasn't worked. But it's important to be able to build towards something. And, you know, a regenerative future, a just oriented future, a future that I want to live in. And that starts, you know, by thinking about the present. And that is what we are doing, you know, with Re-Earth Initiative. I think one of our main goals is to show people that the climate crisis is not in the future, it's already happening now. And because it's already happening now, our solutions cannot be geared towards 2050 or 2040. You know, my friend always says, if you have 1 hour to do your homework, you'll do it in 1 hour. If you have 6 hours to do your homework, you'll do it in 6 hours. And that is what we are doing right now with climate deadlines. We're saying, oh, by 2050, we're going to do this. And so we're going to, you know, push it towards the limit. And then we're going to frenetically try to, you know, stop our emissions, when emissions don't work like that. Carbon doesn't work like that. If it's locked in, it's locked in, and we're going to be seeing those impacts. And that's why I think that timelines have to be tighter so that we can build, you know, have the possibility of building that future. And when I see, you know, companies doing timelines of 2025, that's when I get excited, not when they show me 2050. I think, you know, Re-Earth Initiative is primarily focused on making sure that, not convincing people that the climate crisis is here, because as some of you may know, the United States is very divided because everything is a debate and climate change is either real or not real. So we're not trying to focus on changing people's minds. We're trying to deepen the understanding of those who know it's an issue, and getting people to understand how far and how, you know, interconnected everything is. And so we have different, you know, training sessions of all different sectors, including fashion, including food systems, including the you know, energy, including like even insulation, and how insulation and works for building and energy efficiency. Like we can get very technical and we get very easy, and it's not that entertaining. But when you see it as a part of your repertoire of knowledge building, I think that is when we become most powerful. And, you know, we just help each other out on what career are you going to choose? Am I going to go to when you defend your thesis? Am I going to help you with your college applications? I think like that is what a community-based organization does. It just makes sure that the community is being able to reach their full potential wherever they are. And I think that because we're not focused on, you know, raising money and putting together events, that is what most organizations are doing, we are able to focus on other things, even though we do want to obviously be able to put together events and be able to invite people and be able to maybe have a summit where we all can see each other in person. That has never happened before. But in terms of just building up your knowledge, I think that's what we're focusing on, and showing people that, you know, knowledge is power. And once you have the knowledge, you are able to make, you know, like a future concrete. And my favorite thing is when we update each other on what is going on in our specific cities, what's going on with specific legislation, but then we're able to all understand what's going on at the UN level and question it, and why is it that way, and, you know, what can we do to make it better? Are we giving credibility to the UN by attending? You know, like we ask ourselves all of these questions, and we also ask ourselves, how can we make sure that it's a place where change is actually happening? So yeah, there's a lot of, I think I would define the organization as more like intellect building, rather than, because we're just global, so we can't really do, you know, physical stuff. But I'm excited to see how it's gonna change and grow after the pandemic.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, okay, we have one more.
Hello. It's good that you didn't come to Europe, because it's proven that you want to reduce your carbon dioxide emission and things like that. But what about the personal responsibility of every one of us? What can we do, and what do we have to do to in the climate change?
Yeah, so we have this huge conversation all the time in the climate movement between individual responsibility and then systemic change. And I can say maybe I skipped 3 flights this year that I could have gone to a conference, but I didn't, for example. But then there's an airline that flew 18,000 empty airplanes, keep their spots in the airport. And you think about that difference, the fact that the way that our system works today, an airline had to fly 18,000 empty airplanes. That's more than, I don't know how many times as many airplanes as I can take in my entire lifetime. So I think that the most powerful thing we can do in terms of individual change is advocating for systemic change. And before we even get there, the best thing we can do is to really change our mindsets, to trying to be more conscious. And once you do that, I think everything else follows after. If you want concrete, like 1, 2, 3 steps on how you can reduce your carbon footprint, I think there's so many resources, like thrifting instead of buying new clothes. If you do buy new clothes, make it be from sustainable fashion. Trying to reduce your waste by buying reusable utensils, and all of these things are things that I do on a daily, but I see them more as default. I don't see individual change in terms of reducing my waste and climate impact as activism. I see them as defaults because I think that's the culture to which we need to change towards. What I see as activism is calling out the companies who are still telling you to recycle when they produce, how many tons of plastic a year. Activism is when you call out, just the things that are not being enforced, the insane amounts of pollution that are released in certain cities, in certain communities. So in order to get to a point where we can challenge systemic issues, we do need to change our way of life individually. And more than everything is really symbolic for other people to see you live a lower waste lifestyle, a more conscious lifestyle. And it's, I think, what we're all going to resort to at the end of the day. But know that in order to really empower ourselves to something bigger and something that makes individual changes easier is to advocate for all of these legislations that, legislations that are just going to have to change the parameters for people who don't want to listen or people who don't have the time to research how to have, reduce their impact themselves.
Hi, Xiye. Nice to see you. I remember talking with you briefly last year when we were on Zoom for the Justice Conference. So thanks for joining us again. It's really lovely to see you and hear all the amazing things you're doing. I have a question. I've been working on this Climate Governance Commission, and indeed, I love hearing you talk about policies and legislation. We did a study on key vital policies governments need to implement to accelerate the green transition, for example. So this is wonderful, and maybe I'll share those later with your organization. But my question for you is about COP26 and your experiences there. You were saying, you feel kind of a dilemma maybe in getting involved with UN processes. Are you giving legitimacy to processes that aren't working? They're not ambitious enough, they're not sufficient. But I was just wondering if you could share some thoughts about, what your impression was of the COP26 meeting. What was lacking in terms of, the structure of the event, the processes, yes, but also the human dimension, like the leadership issue. what weren't, the people involved that had the real power and decision-making ability, what weren't they doing? What was the missing element? What was lacking in your view? Just your thoughts about that. And then any thoughts also you have, what could cause a breakthrough? The UN Secretary General has said we're at a point in human history where we either break down, we break through, or we break down. We're at this turning point. In these international processes, is there something that you see as like a key missing element? I know that's a different big question.
Yeah.
Thoughts, insights based on your experience thus far.
Yeah, so to describe COP26, it felt like being in an airport where everyone is talking very loudly, everyone doesn't know each other, and everyone's rushing to different places, thinking they have a destination, but in reality, we're just walking to different rooms. That's what it felt like. And everything, you could only be part of things if you were invited to them specifically. So if you got an invitation, it was very, very hard to be involved in any type of decision-making process. Like, it's unimaginable that if you got invited as a young person or any person from any sector, from civil society, you would have a voice, even if you have something really important to say. So those are the first red flags for me. How do you get, thousands of people from around the world who all have stories, all have solutions, all have grievances, and there are no avenues to listen? No, there are no avenues for that town hall process to happen. I did give a speech at the World Leaders Summit, which is where all the world leaders speak in the first 2 days of the summit. And I closed the first day with a speech that I put a lot of effort into, and I basically listed all of our demands, the demands that youth have been putting together. And I remember I was backstage in this huge state room, and I was looking at all of these world leaders speak. Modi Prime Minister of India, President, and all of these really big political figures that I had only seen online or maybe at other UN conferences, but always from afar. And they were all right there, and it seemed so surreal that this so few people had so much impact on the state of the world. And I think Modi said like he was going to be carbon neutral by 2070, if I remember correctly. And your heart breaks a little when you hear things like that. But I said, I'm going to go on stage, give my speech, and they'll feel what youth are feeling. They'll see that we cannot wait till I'm 68 years old to start doing something. And when I walked on stage, all of the world leaders had already left the room. They had all finished their 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and just left the room. And I understand that they're world leaders. I understand their security issues. I understand they have things to do and places to be. But I did ask myself, you couldn't stay 5 extra minutes to listen to the generation of tomorrow. And that is the disconnect that we have. We are not listening to each other because there's so many barriers that are built in the place where we're supposed to be able to talk to each other, in the place where it is, the only international organization that brings every single country together. And I still gave my speech like the room was full, because I know that it's not about just the people who are in there, but everybody who will receive the message once it's their time to receive the message. And I was very upset for the rest of the day. I was telling my dad, like, how can they do that? How can they, kind of disrespect, very symbolically disrespect the future generation? And that's when my dad told me, you put the message out there, it's their responsibility to listen. And, I think that was very, very symbolic of the UN as a whole, bringing in very important people who are the leaders of the world, but at the same time, making it so that you're so concentrated on the speech that you're giving that you shut everything else out and there's no real conversation. And even in the negotiation rooms, they were closed door. you couldn't get in at all. Mostly people were eating around, watching different exhibitions, traveling around Glasgow. It was a very, very surreal experience. And I think that the solution, first of all, is to create this kind of councils for civil society to be able to speak to elected officials. And also really just make things like the Paris Agreement more legally binding. And I know it's like the responsibility of each country to do so, but I think that more people in our countries need to be able to push for that. Like, are you going to make the things that you agree to legally binding? And are you actually going to follow through?
And we need the youth who see that so clearly, like the legally binding issue. Whereas even mid-career professional international lawyers I talk to think it's too utopian, which is absurd. Of course, we need legally binding international.
Yeah, and we think about like the UN, you can't change the UN, you can't change the UN. The UN has been around for less than my grandparents have been alive. Like if something can be created, it can be changed. So yeah, I mean, still, it is the global stage of the world. I think we have to be able to use it strategically until we are able to change it in a way that, actually represents. I mean, it's hard to represent the world. You can't really do that, but in a way that actually has local impact. I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. And I think we're running out of time. So Marzia, thank you so much. And we'll wrap it up, please. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for speaking, for answering all of our questions, and for staying here for an hour. I know you're a very busy person, and we had a lot to ask. And I think we've all I've learned a lot. And, I've watched your speeches, and every time you speak, you reveal something new. So thank you for that. If everyone is finished with their questions, I think just thank you so much for making time for all of us.
Thank you.